Welcome back to the Side Chat Podcast, where we discuss a little bit of history, a little bit about video games, and this week we will be talking about the P-36 and P-40, which means a bit about North Africa, a bit about Curtis, and quite a bit about AVG and the Flying Tigers. I would also like to mention that next podcast will be a question-answer session, so if you have any questions, like possible questions could be, why do Cobey and the other heathens at TBLF use Imperial versus Metric? Why are we stuck in the Stone Age? That'd be a good question.
Because it's the right way to do it, goddammit, and I said so.
If you want to ask that question, if you want to ask us anything about E3, our opinions, or anything you want to know, War Thunder, whatever you want, feel free to leave that below in the comment.
I'm happy to answer your questions for you.
So, Donovan Berlin, or Don Berlin, was the creator of the P-36. Back in the airplane first flew in 1935. You're going to see the P-36 go by a bunch of different names. One of them is the Hawk 75. That's like the internal Curtis name. And then the export model is Model 75.
The Curtis Model 75 was the airplane. The 75 Hawk was the export version of the airplane. The P-36 was the U.S. version of the airplane.
With these Curtis aircraft, you're going to see a lot of different names, a lot of different variations. It's all kind of boils down to the same aircraft, just little bitty changes here and there that give you different names, so it can get a little bit confusing on... You're just going to see a lot of terminology thrown around. The aircraft first flew in 1935. It was going up for bid for the new U.S. primary fighter. It originally lost to the P-35 from Seversky. Curtis didn't stop there, though. They kept developing the aircraft. They made it into an export model. And then it did really well overseas, so the U.S. Army originally purchased, I think, was like 210 of them for about $4 million, which was the biggest contract for aircraft since 1918.
At the time.
This aircraft, the P-36, saw service with the French. They ordered almost 1,100 of these things. Only 200 made it, though, because of, with a war there. Norway, Dutch, British... The British called theirs the Mohawk, which I found kind of funny. I don't know why, I just did. The Finnish, and all throughout the Pacific, you can see, New Zealand, Australia, the aircraft went everywhere. The export model saw the most combat. The US P-36s, to my knowledge, did not see hardly any combat.
No, not very much at all. They weren't very good airplanes.
The French P-36s were the original ones to see combat. When France originally fell to Germany, though, all the aircraft were rerouted to the UK. So that's where that order went. And then the RAF moved those to Burma, to that British colony. And we're going to bring those aircraft up, those Mohawks that made their way to... So the Mohawks originally bound for France, went to the RAF, and then they made their way to Burma, where the Flying Tigers trained on later. It's kind of funny, full circle, where those airplanes went. But this aircraft was the primary fighter for the U.S. at the time of Pearl Harbor. The P-36 used a 1,200 horsepower radial engine, 430 cals in the wings, 250 in the nose. The biggest problem with this aircraft was it lacked speed. It was a pretty good aircraft in terms of maneuverability and anything you want, but it just was too slow. It couldn't get past that magical number of 300 miles an hour for a top cruising speed. So, when Curtis saw that the European fighters from Italy and Germany were outperforming them, they went to the design board and they tried to design the P-40. The first prototype, the first design for the P-40 was actually something kind of radically different than the P-40 that we know of today. They replaced the radial engine with the Allison, like we know, but they put this kind of experimental Allison turbo supercharged engine, which turbo superchargers were nowhere near ready. This aircraft was called the XP-37. It reached 340 mph. The Army ordered 13 of these things to be built, and the project was eventually abandoned because of the poor visibility and the unreliability of the engine.
Cool little airplane.
You want to talk about the turbo superchargers of this would be like 1939-ish?
Yeah, remember, there was basically brand new technology back then. The XP-37 was kind of a weird airplane. It was basically a P-36 with an Allison hung on the front of it, and that's it. It had a big, giant, huge air scoop on the side of it that ate birds and everything else like that. It was it was not good. It had all sorts of problems with the supercharger and with the the way that the airplane was designed, like I said, all it did was just hang a big ass engine on the front of it, so there was virtually no forward visibility for the pilot. It just had all sorts of overheating problems, and it was just crap. It was garbage.
So the project was canceled, and they went back to the drawing board. And this is kind of funny. They went back to the basic P-36, and they decided that we'll just put a normal Allison engine on there, because the U.S. Army at the time thought that dogfighting would never happen above 15,000 feet.
Yeah.
So they were like, well, we
How
don't.
were we stupid?
Yeah, we don't need it to climb. We just need it to break 300 mph. That was the philosophy. So they ditched the turbo for a conventional supercharger, and the XP-40 first flew in October of 1938, which it's amazing that aircraft dates back to the 30s. April 26th, 1939, 524 P-40s were purchased for nearly $13 million, which was once again the next biggest order made for fighters. Even though this aircraft wasn't particularly amazing, the reason why they got the contract first was because the P-40 was so much further along in design and production. Remember, they're already building P-36s. All you have to do is, you already have the facility, you already have the parts, you already have the people. You're just basically doing an engine change, and voila. So aircraft like the P-39 and the P-38 were still a couple years away from full production. So the P-40 was the best the U.S. had at that time. First P-40 came off the factory in 1940, and it had a top speed of 357 mph. First 200 were delivered in June of 1940, and these were called Warhawks. Curtiss made an export model version for France. They ordered 185. None of them made it, and the RAF took those as well, and those aircraft were called Tomahawks. A lot of different hawk. The first P-40s to see action was over North Africa. We can kind of talk about this back and forth a bit. So the P-40 was completely outclassed in North Africa by the 109Fs.
By everything.
Yeah.
By everything.
And if you ever, there's some really good books written out there about the JG units that were out in North Africa. What it really came down to was the amount of pilots, the training of the pilots, the supplies, and so on. The German pilots just annihilated the Allies to start off the bat, but when it became basically they weren't getting supplies from Italy or Germany, and so without parts, basically a new 109 would land with a replacement pilot in it. They would strip the aircraft apart and use it for three or four other airplanes. They could never replace, or they could never up the squadron numbers. They were just trying to maintain what they had. And as Rommel made his push forward and backwards along the line, the German pilots had to constantly move their home. The living conditions for the German pilots at the end, they had no relief. They were literally sleeping in 6-foot graves. This is real. They actually dug graves along the airfield to sleep in because it wasn't safe above ground. When they abandoned North Africa, this is a horrible story I'll tell real quick. When the last units left Africa, they actually had to put their mechanics inside the fuselage of the 109s, and then they flew to Sicily that way. So they had poor mechanics overheating inside, basically shoved inside their aircraft.
Terrible.
And this is just a quick little side note, just to how I still can't get over how noble this is. Some of the German pilots who had mechanical issues with their 109s going across the ocean, instead of bailing, they actually stayed in their aircraft and died alongside their mechanic. They didn't want the mechanic to die alone, so they made the deal that if their aircraft died, they'd die with the guy inside. So it's just absolutely insane. But the P-40s versus the 109s, the P-40s had no chance in the altitude game. And so the 109s basically were up above, the P-40s were below, and the P-40 pilots accepted that. Now, where the P-40 had the advantage was in numbers and in fresh pilots and in reliability, and the P-40 could take a hell of a lot of damage. You want to talk real quick about the construction of the P-40?
Yeah, the P-40 is actually built kind of weird. It has the strongest wing ever put on an airplane. The FAA did some testing, and NASA or NACA did some testing after the war, and they put a unlimited life limit on the wing. It's the only wing in the world to have that. It's basically, the wing itself is basically bulletproof. It's just ridiculously strong. Curtiss made really, really, really tough airplanes. They really did. They took a beating and kept on ticking, just like a Timex watch. Unfortunately, that's about it. Everything else sucked.
It dove well, it maneuvered all right, but it could not climb, and the Germans just kind of punched, kept hitting them.
Yeah, and part of the problem was the U.S. this stupid insistence on using the Allison engine. Every airplane that we had that had an Allison engine in it was just a piece of garbage. It really was. I mean, were they good? Yes. Could they've been a lot better? Absolutely. But because we insisted on using Allison engines for the P30 with the P40, P38, P39, the P63, it just ruined us. The early Mustang, same thing. It wasn't until we got the Merlin that we actually finally woke up.
The Allison engine finally became good in, well, basically post-war is when they fixed it.
Yeah, oh yeah.
So we're going to talk a little bit about variants, and then we're going to talk about AVG and China, and that's where that's probably where the meat of the podcast will be. The first P-40 come off the line was this called P-40, and the RAF called it Tomahawk 1. This is going to get very confusing, so we'll try to keep this as a generalization because there is a lot of P-40 variants. But yet they're all kind of the same. It's just little bitty changes that they make different names for. So, original P-40, there was 199 of these made. These aircraft were not deemed combat worthy. They had no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, 250 cals in nose, 130 in each wing. The French had a similar model of this aircraft called the H-81A1. These had 430s in the wings. None of them made it. RAF took those over. You can kind of see the trend here. The second variant is called the P-40, basically the B and C model. We'll put those together. Or the Tomahawk 2, which was a big improvement over the original P-40. There was armor for the pilot. They had basically working and better radios. Second 30 cal was added in the wing. That was the B model, basically. The C model added self-sealing fuel tanks and a centerline drop tank, which greatly improved the range. And these aircraft found their way to the Philippines, where they basically immediately saw action. And then they also were at Hawaii at the time of Pearl Harbor.
A couple of them were. Yeah, not
few
too
of them,
many.
not a lot of them, but
yeah.
they were there. And that's basically where, to my knowledge, most of the P-40B and C combat would have been. British, you had a variant. The British variant, the Tomahawk 2, used 303s instead of the US 30 cal. 100 were diverted to the Chinese Air Force to be equipped for the AVG, which became the Flying Tigers. We'll get to that later, like I said. The next variant of the P-40, which is the one we have in game, which is the P-40D and E, or the Kitty Hawk 1. This is kind of where the P-40 finally started to take really good shape. The P-40 that most remember. It had we'll call it a upgraded Allison engine for this one. They had to redesign the aircraft to take the, talk about this. They had to redesign I guess, I don't know how you put this. The aircraft had more thrust, more horsepower, and so the airframe had to be strengthened.
Yeah, they did a major change to the Allison at that time. The Allison went from a direct drive engine to a geared engine, which basically there's a bunch of gears in front of the engine to drive the prop. It's not a transmission, but it's about as close to a transmission as you can get. It's much better for power management and stuff like that. Because of that, they had to take off all the accessory drives for the cowl-mounted machine guns and the engine-mounted machine guns, all the pads for mounting them and all that stuff like that. Because of that, it gave them like an additional 175 horsepower. I think they upped it up to 1750 or something. I don't remember what the hell it was, some number. And then Curtiss had to strengthen the airframe due to the more torque from the prop.
This aircraft also has a different wing, right? That's when they introduced the...
Yes. Yep.
So there's the new wing. They also put a bigger windshield on there. The cockpit was basically improved vastly. With the new wing, they could carry more bombs under the wing, so it became more of a fighter bomber. And then late model, basically the early D had 450 cals, and then the E model had 650 cals. The D variant was mostly an export model. The E variant was the one that the US, I think, used the most.
Yep.
Late production models of the E variant had a dorsal fin, which was used for stability, and we're going to get into this. The P-40 had a bit of a stability issue, so the E model had the late production E models had a dorsal fin. You're going to hear us mention the long tail P-40, which was another attempt at fixing the stability issues. This aircraft though saw service in Pacific, China, North Africa, and in Russia. And you want to talk about the Russian change real quick with the different
Yeah, the
engines?
Russians got a bunch of P-40s Lend-Lease, and they, of course, like the Russians do, modified the shit out of the airplanes, put their own machine guns, and everything else on it. They also, I think, they converted 20 or 25 of them to their own engine, and it was actually very successful. I don't remember what the engine is off the top of my head. Um, it was a very common engine. Let me try to look it up here. It was actually a very successful conversion. They That was the biggest downfall for the entire P-40 line from the get-go, was that stupid Allison. The Army's insistence that they use the Allison engine basically just destroyed the airplane. It would have been a much, much, much better airplane if companies were allowed to use something beyond the Allison engine. Um, the Navy had the same problem. Just kind of as a side note, the Navy was married to this shitty inline six engine that was built by the Ranger Company for all sorts of airplanes. Grumman Widgeon had it, the Curtiss Seamew had it, and it was just a terrible, terrible, terrible engine. But the Navy was married to it, and so manufacturers had to do what the Navy said. And because of that, a lot of people died, and a lot of airplanes suffered because of it. It's pretty crappy. Trying to find that engine. There it is. Chemov M105. I don't remember what that's in. I want to say it's the engine from the Lag, maybe? I don't remember. But it's a great freaking engine.
And then speaking of engines, the P-40F or Kitty Hawk 2 actually switched over to the Packard Merlin. So they ditched the Allison on this model. You're going to see the Allison pop up again. But for the P-40F and Kitty Hawk 2, they actually used a Packard Merlin with a two-stage supercharger. This aircraft had hit 364 mph at 20,000 feet, which is much better than I mentioned with the original P-40, which didn't plan on going past 15,000 feet. They extended the fuselage for stability, so that's basically what we call the long tail on the late model P-40Fs. These P-40s were designed to compete with the German and Italian fighters, so most of these aircraft found their way to the Mediterranean theater. To my knowledge, no Packard Merlin P-40s went to China or anywhere else.
No, they wouldn't have.
The P-40K, or the Kitty Hawk 3, is identical to the late model E1 with the dorsal tail. Like I said, this is where it gets a bit confusing because they kind of jump around. The difference was a different Allison engine. This was the fastest Warhawk made to that point. It was a favorite in China because it still kept the kind of small airframe and maneuverability, but had a bit more power than the original E. So the Flying Tigers preferred the P-40K, or the Kitty Hawk 3. The P-40K, I believe it's the 5 and the 10, had an extended fuselage, so they ditched the dorsal fin at that point, and then they went to the long tail. 192 of these were sent to the British. And then we're going to the P-40L, which is the last Maryland made. Curtiss had a big problem, but once again, back to the engine. They knew that the engine technology wasn't going to get better and wasn't going to save the P-40. So they started ripping off weight. But basically the P-40L and the Kitty Hawk, this version of the P-40 and the Kitty Hawk 2 here, they started ripping off things. They reduced the 50 cals to 4. They lessened the armor. They put a smaller fuel tank on board. It was all about shedding weight. Basically like your high-end sports cars, right? You're paying them to shed weight. The aircraft lost 140 pounds. And in 1943, all the Packard Merlins were prioritized to the P-51B and C, leaving 300 P-40Ls without any engines in them. So they shoved the Allisons in there, and those are P-40Rs. That's actually... I didn't even know that the P-40R existed until I did a little bit of research on it. So the Packard Merlin ended because of the Mustang. You're going to see the Mustang kill the P-40 quite a bit here. And this is kind of the first incident of it. The P-40M, or the Kitty Hawk 3 again, I'm not going to say you usually say like Kitty Hawk 3A or B or C. I'm just going to kind of, like I said, keep this general. It's very similar to the P-40K. It's just a long tail with a different Allison engine. Like I said, most of these changes are just different variations of the engines here. But the most important P-40, which I'm actually shocked it's not in game at this point. I don't know why. Because there was 5,000 of them. Here, guys, you listen to me. 5,000 of this aircraft were built. You might want to put it in game. The P-40N, or the Kitty Hawk 4, This was the final production model. It's very similar to the M, but the original N only had 4 guns. Later, they put it back to 6 guns. So once again, Curtiss couldn't decide, do we want 4 guns, 6 guns? That number just kept jumping around. This aircraft had a smaller fuel tank than the others. It was the fastest, 378 to 380 miles an hour at 20,000 feet. Had better visibility due to a different canopy. They basically replaced a bunch of parts with higher grade materials, right?
Yeah, well, the P-40N was the final production run, and it was basically everything that Curtiss learned about the P-40 they put into the P-40N. The P-40 had a very, very, very big weight problem from the get-go. It was always overweight. It was always underperforming because it was so heavy. So there were several attempts to try to lighten the airframe. Once again, the problem is that with the structure on the P-40, you can only go so far until you have to start taking out stuff like machine guns, and you have to start putting in smaller tires and smaller fuel tanks and stuff like that. So the P-40N is like the ultimate P-40. It's just ridiculous how many were built. The number I used to have the number is I want to say it's like 6,000 total were built. It was just insane. It's a huge number. Most of them went to the Pacific. They fought all over the place down there. A lot of them went to the AVG. A lot of them went to the Chinese Air Force. A lot of them went to Holland and the UK and all sorts of good places like that. New Zealand, South Africa, Canada, for some reason.
It's a very excited bird behind you.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. Most of the most of the surviving P-40s to this day are actually N model P-40s because there were just so many of them built, and they were pretty late in the war. That's it.
You mentioned the P-40N's tires, and when they switched that tire over, the AVG, or at this point they would have been Chinese Air Force or Chinese Tactical, or whatever Chinese Task Force, whatever. They hated that changed that new tire because they didn't have parts really available, and those gravel runways they used over in China just shredded the tires on those P-40s.
Yeah.
Some other noticeable P-40s, like I said, the N-5 is when they went back to 6 guns. The N-40 was metal-skinned ailerons. That's the first time they actually ditched the fabric covered. And 458 P-40Ns went to New Zealand and Australia. One last variant I want to mention is the T-P-40N, which is back then it was very rare to see kind of 2-seat single-engine.
It was very, very, very rare.
So they had a trainer version of the P-40.
It didn't exist.
Yeah, they had a trainer version of the P-40 that had 2 seats in it. The Flying Tigers actually used these as trainers and fighter bombers, and there is one original left near Orlando, Florida, that I had the opportunity to see a couple years ago. And I believe what you say, there's one that was modified.
There's a couple that were converted, yeah. Just like recently, I don't know if you guys noticed, especially over in the UK, you've seen a bunch of 2-seat Spitfires suddenly appear out of nowhere. The same thing was kind of happening to the P-51 and the P-40 back in the 70s and 80s. People were taking the N model P-40s and making them into TP-40s, which basically the N model P-40 had a extended windscreen behind the pilot. It had a different kind of bearing in from the fuselage into the cockpit, and it made a lot of room for a second seat. So basically what they do is they cut a hole in the fuselage, put a seat in it, and call it good. It's happening now to a bunch of Spitfires, especially the Mark 9s, and the Mustangs as well. Now they're called TP-51s.
All right, let's talk about AVG, China, and a little bit about Japanese Army. This is kind of it's gonna be a while right here. This is a very complex theater of warfare that doesn't get talked about very much, and the only thing that you may hear about this war is the Flying Tigers. And so we're gonna talk about a bit about how there's a lot of history, a lot of interesting characters, and there's a lot of history here that I feel just doesn't get exposed. I mean, this was the Japanese and the Chinese fight was just absolutely brutal. I mean.
Yeah, they used chemical weapons against civilians, and they did all sorts of stuff like that. It was pretty freaking bad.
1937, fighting erupted between China and Japan. They had fights before this in the 30s, but this is when the big offensive took place. The Ki-10s quickly dominated over China's airspace, and China was just a mess. They had the central government, but then they had kind of war tribes around, and they had to try to bring everything together. There's a lot of political corruptness and all kinds of things. The pilots were, like I said, poorly trained. They had foreign fighters that were just completely outmatched by the new Japanese, basically, war machine. And then we're going to jump back to the stage real quick where there's a gentleman named Captain Claire Chenault, who was a big advocate for trying to modernize the U.S. Air Force in the 30s. Or sorry, the U.S. Army Air Force in the 30s. And that's a big no-no because, as we know, that's how you make a lot of enemies. And they kind of forced him into retirement early. Next day, he took a job as an advisor over in China where he would basically consult about the state of the Chinese Air Force, and it was not good what he found. It was difficult to secure modern aircraft and Chinese pilots due, like I said, to the corruption that he found in the Chinese government. China was just being annihilated. So by 1939, China was blockaded, and the only port left open was Burma. So that's, if you ever heard the term Burma Road, it's basically a road that ran from the coast of Burma into southern China. That's basically Franklin Roosevelt was kind of convinced and knew that if we needed China in this fight, even before the U.S. declared war, we knew that losing China would be just devastating. So to keep China in the fight, they kind of started this, I guess you call it a little bit of a secret project called American Volunteer Group.
No, I mean it was known that it was happening, but it just wasn't talked about. I mean, it wasn't secret, but it wasn't talked about.
So basically the problem is that the Chinese needed help and fast, and the best way to get pilots, you can't just train pilots overnight. So they went to the American Navy, Marines, and the Army, and they said, hey, how would you like to be mercenaries? You know, we have 100 spots open, and they also took administrators and ground crewmen and so on. But they were basically paid triple or quadruple the price that they were being paid in normal service. And so 100 volunteers went to China with their basically new aircraft to help out. And the main purpose they were there was to save the Burma Road. That was their only objective at the time, was defensive, save the Burma Road. So AVG was formed, and they landed in Burma in the summer of 1941. They trained on those original British Tomahawks that I mentioned way back in the beginning of the podcast. It was also at this time that the Japanese were starting to refit with the new Ki-43. So this is where you're going to see the infamous P-40 versus Hayabusa. Those two aircraft met for years over that continent. Right around Christmas time, the Japanese sent 25 Ki-43s and 63 Ki-21 bombers towards Burma. And basically this massive, over the week, just these massive dogfights kept happening. AVG responded with 13 P-40s on, I believe it was almost Christmas Day, and some RAF Buffaloes. They had a 30-minute huge aerial dogfight. AVG had their first couple of kills. They killed, I believe, some bombers, but they came back pretty heavily damaged. A few aircraft had to land wheels up. But Burma eventually fell to the Chinese about 5 months later, and the AVG had to fall back into southern China. So the only supply route into China to help China was to deliver stuff through India, through what was known as the hump. And I believe that was mostly airlifted stuff, right?
It was all airlifted stuff, yeah. Curtis C-46s, DC-3s, and actually the first few B-29s were modified. The demand for supplies in China were so great that the Air Force took its newest, fastest, highest flying bomber, took all the guns off, put gasoline and cargo racks in it to haul stuff over to China.
Against the American Volunteer Group, these 100 Americans consistently fought against the Japanese army in different theaters. They were kind of, it's kind of weird to describe, but basically their job was air superiority, kill the bombers, and strafe airfields and troop positions, and it was kind of fighter bomber roles. The name Flying Tigers came from the Chinese people. They actually named the Americans the Flying Tigers, and this is where you kind of had the clash of cultures. You had the Japanese army, who was built on a military doctrine, very disciplined, very kind of, close-lipped, and everything was kind of like, I guess you call it, unit-based. Whereas the Americans just did whatever the hell they wanted. They had I believe it was a pet Bengal at their base.
Yeah, Bengal Tiger.
Yeah, they had a Bengal Tiger at their base. They were all known for riding water buffalo around town, because I just thought that was hilarious. And anyway, so this, cowboy Americans. But in the air, Chenault took no crap. Everything was by the book, and the basic rule that the Flying Tigers had was, and I wish War Thunder pilots listen to this. You ready? Here's the trick to defeating Japan. This is from Chenault. Don't fight them at all. You get up, you come down at high speed, you hit them, you don't turn, you don't dogfight, you run away, and then you go back up and you repeat the attack. The rule was never turn fight with the Ki-27s or the Ki-43s. Hit and run, hit and run, hit and run. That was the rule. And these aircraft did pretty well. Eventually, though, the original 99 or 100 pilots were, and there were some famous ones, if you've ever heard the name, Tex Hill, but that's one of the famous original 100. The AVG was disbanded in July of 1942, and it was changed into the Chinese Air Force, I believe Task Force was the title it was given then. This was turned into kind of I'll call it a shit fest, because the AVG was released, their contracts expired with the Chinese government, so they weren't getting that nice paycheck that they loved so much. An Air Force, or basically a U.S. Army Air Force general came in, or Air Corps general came in and said that if you're allowed to leave, but if you go home, when you get off the ship, there will be a recruiter there with draft papers, and you will go into the U.S. Army as a private. Or you can enlist here and continue to fight in China. And that started all hell, and then I believe they relieved that general, and then they put Chenault back in charge, if I remember correctly, or they reinstated Chenault, if that's correct. Anyway.
I think so.
Yeah,
I don't remember what
that's a
happened
little
to
fuzzy.
him.
This whole history is a little fuzzy here. Anyway, Chenault
there's
took
not very good
over.
records.
Chenault went to Tex Hill, the one I just mentioned, and asked him if he would stay behind, and he helped train some of the new U.S. Army pilots that are coming in. It's also important to note that they used the name Flying Tigers. They kept that infamous shark teeth on the front for all their aircraft, even though it's kind of most famous for the 23rd Fighter Group. But there was a lot of fighter groups, and that's what we think. We just think there was that one fighter group. The 23rd is the one that's remembered throughout history.
Well, and the reason why is because the 23rd was the first one to put the shark's mouth on their airplane, and actually the 23rd survives today. They still fly A-10s, and their A-10s still have shark mouths on them.
Right. But everybody in China did this. Like, this was the thing. And
yeah, it was very common.
And even what I love about this, when the bombers came in, the B-25s and B-24s that eventually joined them were so excited to join the Flying Tigers. They put shark mouths on the B-24s. That fucking looks awesome, by the way. But they had B-24s with shark mouths on them. Anyway, so just basically, we could talk about this for a long time, but basically it was this huge cat and mouse game, and the Americans were just shooting down the bombers, shooting down airfields, shooting down this, and we're just constantly trying to be a pain in the Japanese side. The Japanese big priority was to build a railroad line from Shanghai to Indochina. And they initially kind of completed that, but the U.S. attacked it, and then, anyway, just huge fights. A lot of respect between those two aircraft. But it's just interesting, like, one of the things I always found interesting, like I said, about the China conflict is you have American pilots that served alongside Chinese personnel. They couldn't get enough American personnel over there. They had more airplanes than they had people, so they eventually started training Chinese pilots. So the U.S. Army personnel, enlisted personnel, would actually serve alongside Chinese pilots. And then they had Chinese ground crew, Chinese administrators, and so on. So these two different cultures and two different languages were basically forced to work together. And the Chinese pilots, you can say, held their own or more. And then you had the Japanese, and unfortunately we don't know a lot about the Japanese pilots, especially from that theater, because most of the records were lost, or they died. These pilots were basically flown to death because the Japanese did not have the infrastructure to produce more pilots quickly enough. So there was no rest, there was no replenishment, so you just kind of flew until you died, sadly. The ones that did live, due to kind of the way that they were brought up in their culture, they didn't speak about the loss. They just kind of moved on with their lives. And if they did write anything down or shared anything, it's probably in Japanese, and God knows where it is. So unfortunately, there isn't much you can find in English text that talks about the Hayabusa pilots. P-40s over China, most of them were lost to ground fire. The Ki-43s eventually adopted a doctrine that said, don't get involved in air-to-air combat. When the P-40E got over there, or the later models, the Ends, the Hayabusa was completely outclassed. It didn't have the armor. It was basically two machine guns. Didn't have any armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, so it was kind of suicidal. So there was kind of just escort their bombers and get out of the way, because new airplanes were not coming for them. And the other problem is that the Japanese army, the actual ground forces, were actually prevailing against the Chinese army. So this is the problem with any warfare. any war, even today, wars today, when you do too well, you extend your supply line way out, and it becomes harder to move, and it becomes harder to secure, and the P-40 just ravaged the Japanese convoys. But long story short, the battle between the P-40 and the Ki-43, the most noticeable statistic, if you want to boil it down to one number, there was about almost, 14,000 P-40s made in total?
Yeah, it was quite a number.
And I think there was only about 5,700 something Ki-43s built. So just from that number alone, the Japanese could have never kept up. Even if the P-40 was a worse aircraft, and if the pilots were worse pilots, just in numbers that the Japanese had to face would have never prevailed. When I talk about aces from that theater, a lot of these AVG pilots or Flying Tiger pilots get heralded as like the best pilots who ever lived in American history. Most of them had 5 or 6 or 8 kills, maybe at max. Like there was no 20 kill aces over there. The highest one I could find was Richardson with 8. And then you look at the Japanese aces, and they had like 26, 25, 24. Yeah. Most of those kills were against Chinese Air Force before they got there. But they did have, a couple of them had 3 or 4 kills against P-40s. The Japanese pilots that flew Ki-43s were actually good. Like, don't count them out. But we don't have very good records of that. And the problem with trying to find Japanese aces is that usually they took the aerial victory as a unit and not as an individual. So it's kind of hard to find that, and records, like I said, were lost. The Americans, this is the one reason Americans are hard to find which ones are aces or not, is because every damn American pilot, every time we saw a radial engine Japanese aircraft, they go, it's a 0, even though it wasn't. It could have been a Ki-27, a Ki-43. If it had a radial engine, was single engine fighter, and it was a radial, it was a 0, and obviously it wasn't. So they had to institute a 2 kills, or two people had to verify it was a victory. So some victories were unconfirmed and so on. So that's always the problem with aces at that time. By October of 1944, all the P-40s were basically being obsolete. The P-51 and B and C made it into theater in China, and that was a much better aircraft due to the Packard Merlin. So the P-40 was slowly being ditched. Japanese made the move to the Ki-84 and the Ki-43. But anyway, P-40s went completely out of service in June of 1945. The P-47s were actually in China. They took over the bomber fighter role.
Fighter bomber.
Fighter bomber role. And the last P-40 was built in November of 1944. You want to talk about Curtiss in the post-war a bit?
Curtiss didn't do very much after the war. They in the 1930s they merged with the Wright Aeronautical Company to form Curtiss Wright. Basically, what they did is they just built engines after that. Curtiss didn't do very much as far as airplanes after the war at all. Kind of a shame, because Curtiss was actually one of the first airplane companies in the world that was ever made.
And what I find kind of funny is Nakajima, the company that made the Ki-43, the big foe for the P-40, was broken into 15 smaller companies. Eventually that became Fuji Corporation.
Fuji Heavy Industries.
Fuji Heavy Industries, there you go. Who now makes the Subaru, which is like one of the best-selling cars in America. So, Go figure, right? That's how history works out for you. P-40 was just basically doomed due to the performance. Like, it was the best we had. It did the P-40 was everywhere. I don't know. It's almost, at least in my eyes, it's almost like it wasn't pretty. Like, it wasn't a high-performance fighter. It was just...
It wasn't great, but it was the best that we had at the time.
It was made in great numbers, and it did well. It went to the parts of the planet at the time where just, my God, the Philippines, Burma, just nasty theaters of warfare, am I saying nasty theaters of warfare? I mean, these things, they weren't taking off of aircraft carriers. They didn't have access to parts. They were out there by themselves in jungles in harsh conditions, and the aircraft performed well and least desirable things. Like I said, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, France,
and South Africa, the entire Commonwealth had them.
Everybody at one point had a Curtiss product. It was amazing. And then the company, somehow they could not make that next new fighter. They struggled.
They tried. They tried actually a navalized version of the P-40. Looked really, really, really funny. It just looked all weird, but they didn't get any orders, and they just kind of quit making airplanes.
So they went from the best to last, essentially, in World War II. Anything else you want to add about the Curtiss? company or?
No, the P-40 was pretty good. It was, I mean, like I said, you probably think I'm talking bad about it a lot, but it was it was a good airplane. It could have been a lot better if we had a different engine in it. But like I said, the Army's insistence that we stick with the 1710 just really ruined a lot of airplanes. The P-39, the P-38, P-40, early
The U.S.
Mustangs.
Army would have been absolutely screwed up shit creek if it wasn't for the Hawk. Like,
I don't.
what else was
Well,
there?
I don't know about that, but I mean, the P-38 was coming out at the same time. P-39s.
Well, yeah, the P-43
I don't
would have
know.
been probably the next best.
Yeah,
But
but that was sacrilege. That had a round engine on it. How dare you send a round engine airplane up to fight something?
yeah, the biggest thing, like I said, the difference between why they moved to the inline engine over the radial engine was to get that streamlined, less drag. You get that big round nose on the P-36. They moved to that P-40 to reduce the drag, which is how they got more speed out of it. It's just a simple little thing like that. I actually think the P-40, the original P-40's engine was about a couple hundred horsepower less than the radial engine that they were using on the P-36G. But
Yeah.
just
Yep.
reducing that front,
That frontal area. Yep.
you just gain so much speed. So that's also very important to note that I didn't add earlier. If you have, like I said, we're doing question and answer for the next one. The 2-year anniversary of the channel is coming up, so I will be doing live streams throughout the middle of July.
Has it been 2 years already?
Yeah, it has.
Wow.
Early mid-July, after 4th of July, I will be doing live streams quite a bit. I will be giving away 3 games during those streams, and I have some other news that I will share during live stream, so come by and check us out there. The Twitch link is in the description. And like I said, we're doing the question and answer. If you have any questions, ask us, and we will try to answer them next time. Thanks.
Bye.